And what a major depression is about is you sit there and you're that rat, and in this setting you get uncontrollable shocks, but put you in another setting and just by hitting the lever a couple of times you avoid the shocks. You don't bother doing it because you've learned to be helpless. Just like a human depression.
Okay, but the difference between a human and a rat is that a human can learn to change their helpless state. There are many modes by which a human can arrive at free will so that they can start changing this pattern. They can unlearn their helpless state. A rat is more so running on the meat machine narrative. They're more so running robotically and mechanistically. So we've had a couple reviews of Sapolsky's famous lecture from Stanford on depression, and I just want to go over a couple more points before closing this out and moving on to another series. First of all, I want to say Sapolsky is not a psychologist. Sapolsky is a neuroendocrinologist and a hardcore determinist, by his own admittance. And that's cool. I mean, no judgment in that regard. There are flaws in all the philosophies, and that's what I'm here to address. So I really want to make this point. I have not really any more respect for any other scientist than Sapolsky himself. This man has made a major impact on my life and has basically sparked my interest in science about a decade ago when I began watching his lectures at Stanford. His lecture series, Human Behavioral Biology, is free on YouTube. It's a 26-part, 26-hour lecture series. Watch the whole thing. It is fantastic. Very entertaining and engaging teacher too, which is really critical these days. What I mostly took away from that is ways to view the world, ways to view my fellow man and myself, and this very much brought me to a place where I viewed life deterministically for many years afterwards, and that got me quite far, but it also showed me the parts that needed to be worked on. It showed me the gaps that were missing in the acknowledgement and consideration of the whole picture of the human condition. So one thing I took away from that was this idea that's shared amongst other psychologists that 95% of the time people are running around on autopilot. Most of the time they're conforming. The brain is doing the path of least resistance thing. It's compartmentalizing its reality. It diverts to labels and categories and puts people into boxes and puts itself into box. And this is really sad. We need to do something about this. And this is where I believe the process of therapy really comes into play. For me personally, when I began to take CBT courses and took a few hundred hours in cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, rational emotive, these have shown me how we can bump that number up, where we can have more than just 5% agency and actually be less on autopilot and more control, more agential, more activating of free will, more responsive and more introspective and interoceptive, the ability to listen to the physiological signals that our body is sending us, instead of just reacting to them and being beholden to the whims of our own neurochemistry. This is what's neglected in neurochemistry. This is what's neglected in the majority of the sciences, and indeed the psychologically diagnostic process itself. It's wholly deterministic in nature, and we have to bridge these gaps. That's why I'm making these videos. We have to find a way to make some cohesion between the deterministic, categorical, analytical, and atomistic form of science and the more out there, more indeterminate, and more hard to define ways of coming about free will and agency, mindfulness and self-awareness, because that is how therapy works. That's how we're going to make progress. That's how we're going to overcome depression. The options offered by the sciences tend to be medicine first and or treatment, psychological treatment, as opposed to psychological therapy. All that being said, let's take a look at some clips, and I beg for your patience in this regard. I'm not trying to criticize Sapolsky himself, just the process.
At a certain totally simplistic level, what depression is about is the cortex whispering in the ear of the rest of the brain, saying this is as real as you were just physically assaulted by some sort of predator, whatever.
I love that he just put it that way. The cortex whispering to the rest of the brain that these are the experiences that you're having, and it's appropriate to have this negative limbic system response, these psychomotor retardation, the self-injury, the vegetative states, feelings of guilt, feelings of shame, and of course depression. This is the same way I describe it in a lot of my writing, is the whispering to the unconscious mind. What we see with that, the other way to look at that phrase is meditation, is the whole process of reciting mantras. We don't yet know how that works. Sure, it involves the FOXP2 gene and all these other language-based genes, but this is what happens when your doctor encourages you, telling you if you do this, you will get better. This is psychosomatism in the positive light. Psychosomatization, the somatizing in the body of what's going on in your psychology in your head, that has these different mechanisms. It's not just reinforcement loops of telling yourself that you're in a bad situation that's triggering bad problems, you can also tell yourself you're in a good situation, and it can contribute to the production of better situations and healing. The placebo effect is incredibly profound and powerful, and apparently, according to studies, is more effective than SSRIs in relieving depression and anxiety.
And you have just learned in the most big-time awful way, there are things you can't control, and sometimes they are awful. And what have you just learned? There's all sorts of reasons where one can be helpless.
And that's where we have to teach children how to not fall into these learned helplessness states. So that's a function of society. That's a lacking in our education systems.